How can a group of ordinary, psychologically healthy young men be turned into sadists and broken victims in just 6 days? This isn't a rhetorical question. It's the documented result of the Stanford Prison Experiment. The participants were not chosen at random. Out of more than 70 candidates, only 1 in 3 was selected. 24 students whose complete psychological stability and lack of sadistic tendencies were confirmed by a battery of tests. These were not outcasts. They were the best of us, and it is precisely their normality that makes what happened a universal threat. If the system could break them, what's to stop it from breaking you? We will show you exactly how this happens, but the experiment left behind 2 key paradoxes. The first, why did the guards who held absolute power experience the same extreme levels of stress as their victims? The second paradox is even more profound. Why did the good guards, those who didn't personally participate in the abuse, become the primary catalyst for cruelty through their inaction? The answer to this question is more terrifying than the story of the active sadists. It concerns anyone who has ever chosen not to get involved. By the end of this investigation, you will have 7 keys to the Lucifer effect. This isn't a historical tour, it's a manual for hacking the dark side of human nature. In just 3 minutes, you will see how an ordinary university basement was turned into a machine for erasing identity, and how the first stage of transformation began. How could an ordinary Stanford basement transform into a prison so convincing that both guards and prisoners began to forget their real lives? At first glance, the answer lies in the details: real steel bars, tiny 2 by 3 meter cells, and a complete lack of windows or clocks to induce temporal disorientation. But the reality proved more terrifying than the set design. The experiment, planned for 14 days, was abruptly terminated after just 6. The reason: the illusion was too effective and triggered an uncontrollable explosion of cruelty. The environment acted like a slowly cooling room. You don't notice the temperature dropping until you realize you've frozen. The system even consumed its creator. Zimbardo himself later admitted that he stopped seeing an experiment and started thinking about the security of his prison. But the walls were just the beginning. A real prison is built from experience, and that experience began before the participants ever set foot in the basement. What does a person feel when a real police car pulls up to their house on a Sunday morning and they are arrested for armed robbery in front of their neighbors? A crime they didn't commit? The future prisoners were arrested by officers of the Palo Alto Police Department. They were read their rights, handcuffed, and taken to the station with sirens blaring. It seemed like just an element of realism. But it wasn't realism, it was the first act of psychological violence. The participants expected a phone call but received public humiliation instead. Their reality was hacked without warning. They didn't know the arrest would be real. This devastating blow to their sense of security instantly erased their status as Stanford student and imposed the status of criminal. But the most powerful weapon against their identity had not yet been deployed. Why are clocks and windows always removed in casinos, submarines, and solitary confinement cells? This isn't a tradition, it's a ruthless mechanism of control. The absence of day and night cycles disrupts circadian rhythms, increases stress, and makes a person more suggestible. Without a sense of time, the psyche operates like a plant in total darkness. It loses its bearings and becomes dependent on external commands. In Stanford, this became an active weapon. The guards began to use this disorientation to their advantage, holding sudden counts in the middle of the night at 2 or 4 in the morning, deliberately breaking the prisoner's sleep and psyche. These counts quickly transformed from formal checks into hours-long rituals of humiliation. The prisoner's time was taken away. But to completely control a person, you must take something more. If the environment is so powerful, does that mean free will is an illusion? The Stanford prison was perfectly designed. 3 powerful blows to the psyche, a realistic setting, a shocking arrest, and temporal disorientation prepared the mind for further changes. But a stage, no matter how perfect, is lifeless without actors. The real drama began when the participants received their costumes and roles, which proved to be far more powerful tools of influence than concrete walls. The physical prison was built, but that was just the shell. Next came the construction of a psychological prison, invisible yet far more durable. And the first brick in its wall was the destruction of the most precious thing a person has, their name. How can simply changing into a smock and being assigned a number break an adult's will in a matter of days? The prisoners were stripped of more than just their names. They were dressed in baggy smocks with no underwear, forcing them into awkward, feminine postures. Rubber sandals changed their gait, and a tight nylon stocking cap simulated a shaved head. But this wasn't Zimbardo's invention. Replacing a name with a number is a technique proven over centuries in all totalitarian systems, from the armies of Rome to the concentration camps of the 20th century. Its effectiveness proves it is not a symbol, but a mechanism of suppression. A thin chain was fastened to each prisoner's ankle. Its quiet rattle as they walked, even in their sleep, served as a constant reminder of their lack of freedom. This mechanism broke the prisoners. But what did it give to those who held the keys? What caused Douglas Corpy, prisoner 8612, to have a hysterical breakdown after just 36 hours, screaming, "I'm burning up inside"? He was one of the most strong-willed. It was Corpy who led the first rebellion in an attempt to preserve his identity, for which he was thrown into the hole. He didn't give up, but the system wasn't playing. When Corpy started screaming, his pleas were dismissed as faking. Both the guards and Zimbardo himself saw it as an attempt to sabotage the experiment. Instead of help, he received even more pressure. The moment of Zimbardo's realization is captured on film. This was not a game, but a genuine psychotic break. The horror in the creator's eyes was the first sign that everything had spun out of control. But why didn't the cries of a suffering man stop the guards, but only egg them on? Where does the wave of hatred and anonymous internet comments come from? The same mechanism was activated at Stanford with one simple object. The psychology of anonymity is straightforward. When a person is hidden, their sense of responsibility decreases and their aggression increases. The guards' military-style uniforms already created a sense of power. But the key element wasn't the boots or the baton. It was the mirrored sunglasses. They completely concealed the eyes, blocking eye contact, the primary channel for empathy. Talking to a person in such glasses is like trying to warm yourself by a fire through thick glass. The guards later admitted that when they put on the glasses, they felt like different people, more powerful and detached. They stopped being Dave. They became a guard. Have you ever felt different while wearing a mask? Think about how you felt the first time you wore a formal suit or a doctor's white coat. Did you act as you normally would, or did something change? Let's conduct an experiment. Imagine that from this second on, you have no name. You only have a number, say 734. Everyone addresses you only by that number. How long would you remember who you are? This is not just a change in address. The loss of a name is the first step toward the loss of rights and dignity, as the history of the 20th century proves. Clothing and a name are not external attributes. They are the two main anchors of our identity. Remove them, and the personality is cast adrift. The loss of identity in some always enhances the power of others. Some lost their names. Others, by putting on a mask, gained a new identity. What happened when that identity turned out to be a sadist? Was student Dave Eshelman, who became the most brutal guard nicknamed John Wayne, a latent sadist? Or was the ruthless monster created by the role itself? Eshelman later admitted that he was consciously imitating the image of a warden from the film Cool Hand Luke to help the experiment. At first, it was just an acting exercise, but the game was over before it began. On his own initiative, Eshelman started inventing increasingly sadistic punishments, not specified in the instructions. His creativity horrified even the organizers. When one prisoner refused to eat sausages, Eshelman forced him to clean toilets with his bare hands. The mask didn't change him. It gave him permission to become someone he had never been. But why did the other guards obey? How does an ordinary rubber baton become a weapon if it is never used to strike anyone? Like the uniform and sunglasses, it was not a prop but a constant reminder of the distribution of roles, who held power and who was subordinate. However, according to the experiment's rules, direct physical violence was forbidden. This prohibition did not stop the cruelty, it forced it to mutate. Deprived of the ability to strike, the guards invented dozens of forms of psychological violence that proved to be more destructive. Humiliating push-ups, often with a guard on their back, sleep deprivation, and meaningless tasks. A baton in hand works like a knife on the table during a tense conversation. Its mere presence shifts the balance of power. The role of guard demanded dominance. And if the role requires cruelty, where does a person's responsibility end? Perhaps the experiment simply revealed a hidden evil gene? The facts suggest otherwise. All 24 participants passed a screening that proved their complete psychological normality. Their behavior seemed inexplicable until a key mechanism emerged: dehumanization. The guards quickly stopped seeing the prisoners as fellow students. Thanks to the numbers and faceless smocks, they began to perceive them as an inferior mass in need of control. This became the moral justification for cruelty. Dave Eshelman himself watched the video recordings of his behavior with horror, saying, "That wasn't me." The role had completely consumed him. But if it wasn't him, then who or what bears the final responsibility? If the role is so powerful, does that mean we are all just puppets of circumstance? The guard mask gave permission for cruelty, while the prisoner mask demanded submission. This created a perfect, self-sustaining cycle of violence. But the experiment had rules and instructions. Why didn't these formal frameworks work? Because above the role of each individual, above their personal choice, stood something greater, an abstract yet all-powerful and anonymous force that removes all personal responsibility. The name of this force is the system, and it is the system that turns personal cruelty into the norm. How did the prisoners' riot on the second day not destroy, but actually strengthen the prison system? Logic suggested that resistance should have exposed the experiment's fragility. But the opposite happened. The guards, who knew perfectly well that they were dealing with innocent students, gained a powerful moral justification for escalation. They were no longer playing a role. They were maintaining order and ensuring security. Responsibility was diffused. It wasn't a specific guard who was to blame, but the rules and the goals of the experiment. These abstract words became a shield for their conscience. It was only after suppressing the riot that the guards began to invent their own, increasingly humiliating rules, going far beyond the instructions. The system became a self-evolving virus, and that virus began to mutate. But every system has a creator, and his role in this story turned out to be the most sinister. In the famous Milgram experiment, 65% of participants were willing to administer a lethal electric shock on the orders of a man in a white lab coat. Who was this authority figure at Stanford? Philip Zimbardo himself. His status as a professor served as a signal to the guards: everything you are doing is approved by science and has a higher purpose. However, Zimbardo did not give clear orders. His instruction was terrifyingly vague: create in the prisoners a sense of hopelessness, fear, and a loss of control. This ambiguity was taken as a blank check for sadism, a detail that shatters the image of the scientist. When the parents of one prisoner came with a lawyer, Zimbardo met them not as a researcher, but as the prison superintendent, refusing to release their son. The system had consumed even its creator. But its most cunning move was how it made the victims hate each other instead of their tormentors. What makes people in an oppressed group turn on each other instead of uniting against a common enemy? After the riot, the guards used the age-old tactic of divide and conquer. They rewarded 3 prisoners who had not participated in the mutiny. Their beds were returned, they were allowed to wash, and they were given better food, which they ate in front of their punished comrades. This was not an act of mercy, but a diabolically clever blow to solidarity. It instantly sowed discord among the prisoners, causing them to see the source of their suffering not in the guards, but in the traitors from their own ranks. A few hours later, the guards suddenly mixed the good and bad prisoners, creating total paranoia. No one knew who the snitch was or who could be trusted. Resistance became impossible. The system had learned to protect itself and began to strengthen according to its own exponential laws. If each individual guard was committing only a small evil, justifying it with orders, where did the concentrated horror that forced the entire experiment to be shut down come from? We have seen how the system absolved participants of personal responsibility, how Zimbardo's authority legitimized their actions, and how internal manipulations destroyed the will to resist. All the components for a catastrophe were in place. But the real danger of a system is that evil within it never stays at one level. It acts like a snowball rolling down a hill, rapidly gaining mass and speed. One small spark of cruelty ignites the neighboring, dry branches of passivity, and soon the entire forest is ablaze. Next, we will examine how this fire spread, how an innocent nightly count turned into sophisticated torture, and why this process, once started, is nearly impossible to stop. How could simple verbal humiliation escalate into physical torture in just a few days? The fact of the cruelty is less shocking than the speed of its escalation. Violence never remains static. It always demands intensification. This is the slippery slope effect. It all starts small, with coercion to perform meaningless actions. At this stage, the guards don't yet see themselves as sadists. They are merely maintaining order. But archival records show that this order quickly required disproportionate punishments. For refusing to eat sausages, prisoners were deprived of their beds and forced to clean toilets with their bare hands. This was no longer discipline, but an act of domination. The threshold of what was acceptable shifted every hour. What seemed unthinkable on the first day became routine by the fourth. And this terrifying adaptation to evil found its perfect expression in the darkness. What caused a simple nightly count which took 10 minutes on the first day to evolve into hours-long sessions of abuse? This was not written in the instructions. This was the psychology of power unleashed in the dark. The evolution was gradual. Day 1, a quick check of numbers. Day 2, push-ups for mistakes. Day 3, collective punishments. But by the fourth night, the purpose had completely changed. The counts became a tool for sophisticated humiliation. Guards forced prisoners to simulate homosexual acts and shout insults at each other. Discipline was replaced by outright sadism. Records show that the night shift guards, including John Wayne, were the most brutal. They mistakenly believed they were being observed less, but to do such things, they needed to justify it to themselves. This fact defies logic. The more cruelly the guards treated the prisoners, the more they began to despise them. Why did increasing aggression not provoke guilt, but instead reinforce their sense of righteousness? This is a mechanism of psychological self-defense, cognitive dissonance. The belief I am a good person conflicts with the action I am hurting someone. To resolve this discomfort, the brain changes not the action, but the belief about the victim. He is not a person, but a bad prisoner. He deserves this. This is not a one-time act, but a self-perpetuating cycle. Each new, more brutal act required even greater dehumanization of the victim. To justify forcing them to clean toilets, it was necessary to see the prisoners not just as rule breakers, but as animals. In their reports, the guards began to describe them as dangerous, actively constructing an alternate reality. Have you ever convinced yourself that someone you treated poorly had it coming? So the machine of evil is assembled. The environment applies pressure, numbers erase identity, the mask becomes the face. The system removes guilt, and violence spirals out of control. Does this mean that individuals are completely powerless? The machine is running at full tilt. But here's a detail that breaks this pattern. Zimbardo's data shows that about a third of the guards were good. They did not participate in the abuse. Of the 9 guards on a shift, only 3 actively displayed sadism. Why then did the presence of the others not only fail to stop, but even fail to slow down the machine of evil? This question brings us to the experiment's most disturbing discovery. We will prove that under certain conditions, passive good does not just become useless. It transforms into silent approval and the main catalyst for active evil. Logic suggests that not committing evil is already a good thing, but Stanford proves the opposite. The inaction of the good guards turned out to be more dangerous to the system than the actions of the sadists. Their silence served as fuel. It was more important for them to remain part of the guard group than to speak out against injustice. The fear of becoming an outcast paralyzed their will. But their passivity was perceived by sadists like John Wayne not as neutrality, but as tacit approval. When no one objects, the aggressor concludes that their actions are supported. To soothe their consciences, the good guards would secretly give prisoners a cigarette or some food. But they never openly challenged the cruelty. This silence created an illusion of unity, but in reality, each of them was fighting a desperate internal battle alone. Why is it that the more witnesses there are to a crime, the less likely it is that someone will help? This is the bystander effect. Everyone thinks that if the situation is critical, someone else, someone braver, must intervene. Personal responsibility dissolves into the collective. But here's a fact that shatters this illusion. Psychological tests after the experiment showed that the stress and anxiety levels of the good, passive guards were almost identical to those of the broken prisoners. Their silent complicity in evil was destroying them from the inside. The system maimed everyone, victims, perpetrators, and observers alike. Passivity turned out not to be a way to avoid harm, but a form of slow psychological suicide. The entire prison was trapped in a vicious cycle of madness. But the key to escape lay outside its walls. Inside the experiment, cries for help were ignored. So why was a graduate student's quiet voice able to stop what the victim's screams could not? On the fifth evening, Christina Masloch, Zimbardo's fiancée, came down to the basement, invited to conduct interviews. She was not part of the experiment. She didn't know its rules. And when she saw guards leading prisoners with bags over their heads to the toilet, her reaction was not scientific curiosity, but human horror. She was the only one not playing the game. Her confrontation with Zimbardo became the turning point. She said a simple phrase: "What you are doing to those boys is terrible." This voice of empathy broke through the wall of systemic justifications. But why did the creator, who had been deaf to everything else, hear her? Dozens of people inside the system were blind, while one person from the outside could see. This reveals a fundamental law. It is nearly impossible to resist a system from within, because it distorts the perception of all its participants. The hero is not the one who is stronger, but the one who is not part of it. But why didn't Dr. Zimbardo himself, a scientist trained in objectivity, see what Christina Masloch saw? He had all the information, saw all the recordings, heard all the cries. He was blind because he had made the most terrible mistake a researcher can make. He ceased to be an observer. He himself had become part of his machine, the chief superintendent of his own prison. And it was this transformation that became the final, seventh key to the Lucifer effect. Officially, he was the lead researcher, but to the participants from day one, he was the prison superintendent. This dual role was not an oversight, but a conscious choice that destroyed his objectivity. Archival records prove it. Zimbardo wasn't observing, he was directing. He personally instructed the guards to be firm. He personally ignored parents' pleas. He personally participated in suppressing the riot on the second day, seeing it as a threat to his order, not as valuable scientific data. But the most horrifying episode involved prisoner 86 Linpuo. When Douglas Corpy broke down screaming, "I'm burning up inside," Zimbardo saw not a psychotic break, but sabotage. He didn't release him, a gross violation of protocol, but convinced him to return to his cell as an informant. At that moment, the scientist died, and the prison superintendent was born. He was deaf to the victim's cries, but could not ignore the voice of the person he loved. What does it take for a person with absolute power to realize they have become a monster? For Zimbardo, that moment was a single conversation. When Christina Masloch went down to the basement, she didn't see behavioral patterns on monitors, she saw humiliated and suffering human beings. Zimbardo tried to defend himself using scientific terms, but she struck not at the scientist, but at the man. Her words, "What you are doing to those boys is terrible," were a personal accusation. She blamed him, not the system. It was a blow that pierced the armor of his role. For the first time, he saw the experiment through her eyes and, most terrifyingly, saw himself in that horror. It was his catharsis. That same night, completely alone, he made a decision. On the morning of the sixth day, just 12 hours after that conversation, the experiment was abruptly terminated. But its consequences could no longer be undone. The experiment lasted only 6 days. Can we assume that everything went back to normal once it ended? The debriefing records show shock and confusion. The The guards watched videos of their own cruelty and couldn't believe it was them. But subsequent interviews conducted years later proved the scars remained forever. The prisoners suffered from the memories, but the guards sustained an even deeper trauma: the knowledge of the cruelty they were capable of. Their confidence in their own goodness was shattered. Philip Zimbardo himself dedicated the rest of his career to studying the Lucifer effect, trying to explain to the world the monster he himself had unleashed. The experiment ran for less than 43% of its planned duration but managed to inflict a lifetime of damage. We have seen how a perfectly tuned machine of evil operates. We have proven that even its creator can become its slave. Does this mean humanity is doomed? No. The role of authority of Zimbardo himself proved to be key. Evil does not arise spontaneously, it is always sanctioned by power. But therein lies the hope. Since we understand how this machine is built, we can learn how to dismantle it. Knowing the 7 key mechanisms is not just a historical fact, it's a vaccine. It doesn't guarantee you won't get sick, but it gives you a chance to recognize the symptoms and fight back. The experiment in the Stanford basement ended long ago. But every day, in offices, armies, and online communities, new little prisons are being built. Next, we will bring all 7 keys to these prisons together and see how they can unlock doors not to the past, but to our own lives. It's time to assemble the complete blueprint of the machine of evil. This isn't a list, but a lethal algorithm of 7 interconnected elements. It all begins with the first, the perfect prison, a powerful situation that sets the rules of the game. This situation creates the groundwork for the second, the loss of a name, de-individuation, which erases identity and turns people into functions. This, in turn, allows the third element, the power of the mask, to completely take over the mind, substituting a role for personality. When a person becomes a role, the fourth element comes into play, the diffusion of responsibility. An anonymous system becomes a shield that removes personal guilt. This gives the green light to the fifth element, the spiral of violence, a mechanism of constant escalation. The gears of this machine are lubricated by the sixth element, the silence of the good, passivity that acts as tacit approval. And finally, the entire machine is started by the seventh element, the creator effect, a sanctioning authority. This system works like soil erosion. The situation is the constant wind. De-individuation is the fine sand it carries. Each grain's impact is imperceptible, but over time they grind down the hardest rock of human morality. Now, knowing how this machine is built, we will answer the 2 main questions it left behind. The first question, why did not only the prisoners but also the guards experience the highest levels of stress? The answer, because complicity in evil, even as a perpetrator or a passive observer, destroys the psyche. Cognitive dissonance and the constant need to justify one's cruelty are an immense psychological burden. The system injures everyone without exception. The second most important question, why did the good, passive guards become catalysts for evil? The answer has 2 parts. First, their silence was perceived by active sadists as a sign of approval, giving them free rein. Second, for the prisoners, their passivity was the final blow. It killed any hope that at least one representative of authority was on their side, intensifying their sense of absolute hopelessness. Passive good proved to be a poison, but knowledge without action is useless, so what should you do? The Stanford Prison Experiment is a textbook on self-defense. All the information boils down to 3 main lessons, 3 keys that can help you avoid becoming a cog in someone else's machine. Lesson 1. Awareness. Always ask yourself, why am I doing this? Is this my decision, or am I just following rules, orders, or the majority opinion? The first step to freedom is recognizing the chains. Lesson 2. Personal responsibility. Never hide behind phrases like, I was just following orders, or everyone else was doing it. Ultimately, you alone are responsible for your every action and inaction. Responsibility cannot be diffused among a group, it can only be shifted by deceiving yourself. Lesson 3. The courage to say no. Remember Christina Masloch? Her simple human no proved stronger than the entire system. It is better to be the outlier who does the right thing than part of the gray pack committing evil. This isn't about heroism, it's about basic psychological hygiene. The Stanford Prison Experiment is a mirror. We have shown you all its facets and given you the keys. And now for the final, most difficult question. A question not for us, but for you. After everything you have seen, be completely honest with yourself. Forget who you want to be. Think about who you would most likely have become if you had been in that basement in 1971. A cruel guard enjoying power? A passive guard afraid to go against their peers? Or a broken prisoner who quickly loses their will? In the comments, write just one word that seems to you the most likely and honest answer: cruel, passive, or broken. There are no right or wrong answers here. This is an anonymous test of honesty with yourself, and the first step toward never finding yourself on any of these three sides in real life.